For 4 evenings in a row, Faye Renfro stood at the edge of the flooded timber behind her property and watched the same thing happen. As the sun slipped below the trees, hundreds of wild ducks drifted in from every direction. But instead of scattering across the swamp, they all settled into the same small corner of the water as though the rest of the wetlands simply didn't exist. She returned the next evening expecting it to be a coincidence, then the next, and then the one after that. Every time, the birds made the very same choice. On the 5th evening, curiosity finally overcame caution. Instead of watching from the bank, Faye stepped into the shallow water and followed them, pushing farther into the flooded timber than she had in years. The deeper she went, the more obvious it became that every flock was circling toward the exact same patch of water. She stopped, not because the ducks flew away, but because she suddenly realized they knew something about this land that she didn't. The divorce settlement waiting on her kitchen table disappeared from her thoughts. All she could think about was one question. Why did every duck keep choosing this place? As you listen, pay close attention to that one corner of the swamp, because the answer to why the ducks kept returning there is also the reason the land everyone dismissed eventually became the most valuable thing Faye ever owned. 2 weeks earlier, Faye's life had looked very different. After 20 years of marriage, she and Wade signed the final papers that divided everything they had built together. Wade kept the productive cropland that had supported the family for years, while Faye received the 50 acres of flooded swamp bottom nobody had ever considered worth farming. The quitclaim deed transferred the property for the standard legal wording of $3 and other valuable consideration, but the paperwork attached to it carried a much heavier number. Under the property settlement note, Faye had 14 months to pay an $85,000 buyout. If she couldn't prove the swamp had real value, it would remain little more than neglected land attached to a debt she had no realistic way of paying. She didn't have a business plan yet. She wasn't dreaming about ducks or thinking about wetlands. She only knew she had to find some way to make 50 forgotten acres worth more than everyone believed before the deadline ran out. The first person she spoke to was her neighbor, Jean Tolliver, who had spent more than 30 years growing rice on the adjoining farm. Jean listened patiently as Faye explained that she couldn't stop thinking about the wild ducks using the flooded timber. When she finished, he leaned against the fence and gave a slow shake of his head. "Faye, I've watched ducks work those woods my whole life," he said. "That doesn't mean you can build a business raising your own. Wild birds and domestic birds are two completely different things." She thanked him and started back toward the house, but his words stayed with her. If someone who had watched those ducks for 3 decades couldn't see any real value in that swamp, who else ever would? Faye couldn't stop thinking about Jean Tolliver's reaction. If a man who had spent 30 years watching wild ducks work those flooded woods believed there was no future in them, was she chasing an idea that had already failed before it even began? Rather than guessing, she sat down at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began sketching the rough outline of a business she barely understood. It wasn't polished, and it certainly wasn't complete, but it was enough to take to the county extension office, where she hoped someone could tell her whether she was wasting her time or not. The poultry specialist listened carefully as Faye explained what she wanted to do, then spent several minutes studying the handwritten figures in front of her. When she finally looked up, there wasn't any ridicule in her expression, only honesty. "Commercial duck farming is a real business," she said. "People make good livings doing it every year. But starting from scratch isn't cheap." She pointed to the list Faye had prepared before continuing. "You'll need housing, brooders for the ducklings, feed, breeding stock, fencing, water systems, and equipment. Before most farms see meaningful income, they've already invested tens of thousands of dollars." Faye asked the question that mattered most. "So you're saying it can't be done?" The specialist slowly shook her head. "No, I'm saying your timeline is almost impossible." That sentence stayed with Faye all the way home because she realized the problem wasn't whether duck farming could succeed. The problem was whether it could succeed quickly enough to beat a deadline that was already counting down. Still hoping determination might buy her more time, she arranged one more meeting, this time with Wade's attorney. She explained that she intended to build something on the swamp instead of selling it, and asked whether visible progress might affect the settlement. He listened politely before folding his hands across the desk. "Mrs. Renfro," he said calmly, "courts don't measure effort. They measure payment." Sliding a copy of the property settlement note toward her, he continued, The amount is fixed. The deadline is fixed. Whatever you choose to build on that property is entirely your decision, but the payment date doesn't move. There was nothing more to discuss, and Faye drove home knowing the law wasn't going to bend for good intentions. The hardest conversation came later that evening on the porch. Della had already watched her parents lose a marriage that neither of them believed would ever end, and now she watched her mother carrying papers from one meeting to another, searching for an answer that still hadn't appeared. Quietly, she sat beside Faye, looked across the flooded timber stretching behind the house, and said, "Mom, I don't need another promise. I just need this to work." Faye reached for her daughter's hand, but couldn't find the words she wanted because she understood exactly what Della meant. At that moment, the future of the swamp stopped being only about paying a settlement or proving people wrong. It became about making sure her daughter didn't have to lose her home a second time. If you've ever had to build a future from the one thing everyone else had already given up on, then you already understand what Faye was fighting for. Stay with this story, because the answer she discovers isn't something she planned. It was already waiting on her land. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. A few days later, Boyd Hutto stopped by the property. For years he had guided duck hunters through the flooded timber surrounding Stuttgart, and he knew those wetlands better than most people ever would. Faye asked him why the wild ducks kept choosing the same corner of her swamp every evening. Boyd watched the water for a long moment before answering. "Food and cover," he said quietly. "That's what keeps him coming back." Then he turned and walked back toward his truck. No explanation. No lesson. No attempt to tell Faye what she should do next. Just one short sentence that somehow left her with even more questions than before. She still owned 50 acres, almost everyone considered worthless. She still owed $85,000. She still had no proven business and almost no working capital. What she didn't realize was that the flooded timber everyone dismissed had already begun pointing her toward the answer she had been searching for all along. With 9 months remaining before the settlement payment came due, Faye stopped thinking about what the swamp couldn't do and started working with what it could. Borrowing carefully against what little credit she still had, she built a modest duck operation along the highest and driest edge of the flooded timber, where the ground stayed firm enough to support pens and brooders without disturbing the wetland itself. From the beginning, she divided the farm into 2 practical income streams. Khaki Campbells would provide premium duck eggs, while Pekins, the standard commercial meat breed, would supply the birds she hoped would eventually generate the larger share of her income. Every purchase had to justify itself, because every dollar she spent brought her one step closer to the settlement deadline. Before long, her days settled into a routine that rarely changed. She checked the brooder before sunrise, making sure every duckling was warm enough through the cool Arkansas mornings, then fed and watered the birds, cleaned the pens, repaired fencing, and recorded the previous day's egg production before leaving for whatever hours the feed store could offer her. By late afternoon, she was back home, working until darkness settled across the swamp. The days were long, the work repetitive, and progress often felt painfully slow, but every healthy bird represented another small step toward keeping the land. By the end of the 3rd month, those small steps were beginning to add up. Egg production had become consistent, losses among the flock had dropped sharply, and the ducks were growing stronger with each passing week. A handful of local customers started buying eggs regularly, giving Faye the first real income the farm had produced. It wasn't enough to solve her financial problems, but it was enough to convince her the business might actually have a future. That confidence was tested one cold night, when a brief power interruption shut down the brooder's heat lamps. Ducklings depend on steady warmth during their first weeks of life, and by the time Faye discovered the problem at daybreak, several had already died from exposure. The loss wasn't large enough to destroy the operation, but it was enough to remind her how fragile everything still was. One mistake, one equipment failure, or one unexpected expense could erase weeks of hard work. Even as the farm slowly improved, another question continued weighing on her mind. If duck eggs alone couldn't produce enough income to meet the settlement deadline, would the meat side of the business ever close the gap? Several months later, the answer finally seemed within reach. The Khaki Campbells were laying steadily enough that 2 bakeries in Little Rock agreed to buy eggs on a regular basis, and the Pekins had reached market weight exactly as planned. For the first time since the divorce, the numbers were moving in the right direction, and Faye allowed herself to believe she might actually pull it off. Then everything stopped. As she prepared to sell her first batch of pecans, she learned that federal law required all commercially sold duck meat to be processed at a USDA-inspected facility. It wasn't a regulation she could ignore or work around, and when she began calling nearby processors, every appointment was booked months beyond her settlement deadline. Her ducks were ready. The customers were ready. The law wasn't. In a single afternoon, the strongest part of the business became the one thing she couldn't use, and Faye realized the greatest obstacle standing between her and the farm was no longer raising ducks. It was finding a legal way to sell them before time ran out. With only 2 months remaining before the settlement payment came due, Faye finally stopped hoping the numbers would somehow improve on their own and forced herself to face them exactly as they were. She spread every receipt, every invoice, every feed bill, and every deposit across the kitchen table, checking the figures again and again as though she might discover something she had missed. The egg business was performing better than she had dared to expect. The khaki Campbells were laying steadily, the bakeries were paying on time, and the pecans had reached market weight exactly as planned. Restaurants were interested in buying them. But none of that mattered because she still couldn't legally sell a single bird without USDA-inspected processing. Everything she had spent months building had become trapped behind a regulation she hadn't even known existed when she first decided to raise ducks. When she finished adding the figures together, the answer was impossible to ignore. She was still short. She leaned back in her chair and looked across the room, where Della sat quietly finishing homework at the same kitchen table. The settlement papers lay only a few feet away, a constant reminder that every passing day brought the deadline closer. Faye realized that losing the property would be painful enough, but asking her daughter to leave another home after everything the family had already been through felt far worse. For the first time since signing the divorce papers, she seriously considered calling Wade's attorney to ask what happened when someone simply couldn't make the payment. Instead of reaching for the telephone, she walked outside and followed the narrow path leading toward the flooded timber. Evening settled slowly across the swamp, and before long the familiar sound of wings drifted through the trees. One flock arrived, then another, until hundreds of wild ducks settled into the very same corner of the wetland they had chosen every evening since autumn began. Faye stood quietly beneath the trees, watching them gather in exactly the same place, and found herself wondering whether she had become so focused on solving her financial problems that she had stopped paying attention to what the land had been trying to show her all along. Before she could return to the house, Boyd Hutto's old pickup rolled into the driveway. He climbed out, spent a few moments watching the ducks circling over the timber, then slowly looked across the pens where Faye's birds were feeding. After a long silence, he turned toward her and asked, "Tell me what you think your biggest problem is." "I can't sell the ducks," Faye answered without hesitation. Boyd nodded as though he had expected exactly that response. "Then that's the only problem worth solving today." He reached into his shirt pocket, unfolded a small piece of paper, wrote down a telephone number, and handed it to her. "Call first thing tomorrow morning." That was all he said before climbing back into his truck and driving away. Early the next morning, Faye called the number Boyd had given her. It connected her with an extension partnership coordinating a USDA-inspected mobile poultry processing unit that traveled directly to small farms. Instead of hauling birds hundreds of miles to a processing plant, producers could schedule the inspection to come to them. By pure chance, another farmer had canceled an appointment only days earlier, leaving one opening before Faye's settlement deadline. If she could prepare everything in time, every market-ready pecan on the farm could finally be processed legally and sold. For the first time in weeks, Faye allowed herself to believe she still had a real chance. The problem had never been the ducks. It had simply been finding a legal way to bring them to market before time ran out. Processing day arrived just after sunrise, and by the time it was over, the months of preparation had finally become something tangible. The mobile processing unit handled the pecans exactly as required under federal inspection, allowing Faye to sell them legally for the first time. Her khaki Campbells continued producing premium eggs for the bakeries that had become regular customers, while several restaurants placed standing orders for duck meat after seeing the quality of her first processed birds. For the first time since the divorce, the duck farm no longer felt like an experiment struggling to survive. It had become a genuine working business with two reliable sources of income. That evening, Faye returned to the kitchen table and carefully totaled every payment she had received. She added together the bakery contracts, the duck sales, and every deposit she had managed to save over the previous year. The figures were encouraging, far better than she could have imagined when she first stood looking across 50 flooded acres that everyone else believed were worthless. Yet when she reached the final number, she realized she was still short of the amount required to satisfy the property settlement note. The duck farm had transformed her financial future, but it still hadn't completely solved the problem that threatened the land itself. A few evenings later, she found herself back at the flooded timber, almost without thinking about it. The same familiar sound echoed through the trees as flock after flock of wild ducks appeared overhead. Just as they had every evening before, they ignored the rest of the swamp and settled into that same small corner of flooded timber. Watching them, Faye remembered the evening she had first followed them into the water and realized she still didn't know why they chose that one place so consistently. Boyd arrived a few days later with someone he wanted her to meet, a wildlife biologist from the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission who specialized in waterfowl habitat throughout the Mississippi Flyway. Together, they spent the day walking the flooded timber, studying aerial photographs, comparing migration records, and examining the surrounding landscape. The biologist paid particular attention to the relationship between the flooded hardwoods, the nearby rice fields, and the shallow water that covered the timber each winter. Only after completing the survey did she explain what she had discovered. The corner of flooded timber that had captured Faye's attention wasn't simply another piece of wet ground where ducks happened to land. It occupied one of the most dependable natural stopover habitats along that section of the Mississippi Flyway. The surrounding rice country provided abundant food during migration, while the flooded hardwood forest offered shelter, security, and ideal resting conditions. Year after year, generation after generation, wild ducks returned because nature had already made that location one of the best places to stop on their long journey south. As Faye listened, she suddenly understood why every flock had ignored the rest of the swamp and chosen that same corner every evening. The ducks hadn't been behaving strangely at all. They had simply been following instincts perfected over countless migrations, quietly revealing the true value of land that people had spent years dismissing. The biologist then explained something Faye had never considered. Highly productive private waterfowl habitat carried value beyond conservation because experienced hunting outfitters regularly leased dependable wetlands for seasonal hunting. After comparing similar properties throughout the region, she prepared a conservative estimate showing that the flooded timber alone could reasonably generate about $18,000 every hunting season without changing the habitat that made it valuable. At that moment, everything finally came together. The duck farm had become a successful business because Faye was willing to do the work. The flooded timber became a lasting source of income because she finally understood what it had always been. The ducks had never been trying to lead her toward wealth. They were simply following the same path nature had given them long before anyone measured that swamp in dollars. And Faye's life changed because she stopped asking what the land couldn't become and finally understood what it already was. The first person to come back was Jean Tolliver. Word spread quickly through the community that Faye's small duck operation wasn't disappearing the way most people expected. One afternoon, Jean pulled into the driveway, climbed out of his truck, and slowly walked along the fence line without saying much. He watched healthy khaki Campbells moving confidently through their pens, examined a group of market-ready pekins waiting for delivery, and noticed employees from a local restaurant loading fresh birds into a refrigerated truck while another customer picked up trays of duck eggs from the packing shed. After several minutes, he looked back toward the flooded timber and gave a quiet laugh. "I guess I judged this place by the wrong standard," he admitted. "I kept looking at what you couldn't grow out there instead of what you already had." Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked whether Faye expected to have breeding stock available the following spring, because he was beginning to think a few ducks might fit his own operation after all. A few weeks later, the poultry extension specialist returned to review the farm's first full year of records. She carefully studied egg production, meat sales, flock health, feed costs, operating expenses, and business growth before closing the ledger with a smile. "I've seen people start with more money and accomplish much less," she said. "Would you consider speaking at our beginning farmer workshop this fall? There are a lot of people who could learn from what you've built here." For Faye, That invitation meant as much as any financial report because it came from the same person who had once warned that her timeline was almost impossible. The final settlement meeting lasted only a few minutes. Wade's attorney reviewed the paperwork, confirmed the payment had been completed before the deadline, and handed Faye the signed documents showing the property settlement note had been fully satisfied. There were no extensions to request, no negotiations left to hold, and no courtroom waiting at the end of the process. The very land everyone believed would never pay for itself had done exactly that. The moment Faye treasured most came several evenings later when she and Della stood together at the edge of the flooded timber, watching another evening flight of wild ducks sweep low across the water before settling into the same corner of the swamp where the story had begun. They watched quietly until the last of the birds disappeared among the trees. After a long silence, Della looked at her mother and softly asked, "We're not moving, are we?" Faye smiled, slipped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, and answered simply, "No." Before duck season ended, Faye found Boyd repairing a section of fence near the timber and tried once again to thank him for everything he had done. She even offered to pay him for the advice that had changed the course of her life, but Boyd simply shook his head. Those ducks knew what that land was worth long before either of us did, he said as he looked across the flooded water. You were just patient enough to listen. With that, he climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving Faye standing beside the same swamp that had once looked like the least valuable part of the farm. By the end of her first year, those 50 acres supported 3 connected income streams. The Khaki Campbells produced steady premium egg sales, the Pecans supplied restaurants through recurring meat contracts, and the flooded timber itself generated dependable seasonal hunting lease income every winter. What had been transferred on paper for $3 had become the foundation of a business capable of supporting both Faye and Della for years to come. For years, everyone who looked at that swamp asked exactly the same question. What can you possibly do with land that floods every winter? It sounded like a sensible question because the ground could never compete with rich cropland. It couldn't produce the same harvests, and it certainly didn't look like the kind of property anyone would choose if they wanted to build a future. Almost nobody asked a different question. Why did the wild ducks keep choosing that place year after year? The ducks weren't trying to lead Faye toward a business, and they certainly weren't trying to make her wealthy. They were simply following instincts that had carried them along the Mississippi Flyway for countless generations, returning to the same flooded timber because nature had already made it exactly what they needed. The answer had been there long before the divorce, long before the settlement papers, and long before anyone measured that swamp in dollars. Nature already understood the value of that land. People simply measured it by the wrong standard. Faye never succeeded because she forced the swamp to become something it wasn't. She succeeded because she slowed down long enough to understand what it already was. Sometimes the greatest opportunities aren't hidden because they're impossible to find. They're hidden because most people decide something has no value before they ever take the time to understand it. 1 year after receiving 50 flooded acres that almost everyone believed were worthless, Faye returned to the edge of the timber as evening settled over the swamp once again. This time, she wasn't standing there alone. Della stood beside her while another wave of wild ducks swept across the water before settling gently into the same corner that had first captured Faye's attention months earlier. The duck farm had become a thriving business. The seasonal hunting lease continued bringing dependable income every winter, and the land people once laughed at had become the most valuable part of the farm. Not because Faye had changed the swamp into something different, but because she had finally understood what it had always been. If you were standing where Faye stood that first evening, would you have followed those ducks into the flooded timber, or would you have written the swamp off like everyone else? Why? If you enjoy stories about forgotten American land, overlooked opportunities, and remarkable discoveries like this one, subscribe. There are still plenty of forgotten American stories waiting to be told.